Hey, everybody, it's time for my second lecture from the New Testament, which will be sort of relatively brief here, um, on Paul's epistle to the Romans, or letter to the Romans, as it's sometimes called. Um, it's a very different kind of document, obviously, from Mark, um, though obviously it's going to share some of the same themes. Um, so first of all, the question here is who was Paul? Um, Paul is known best as one of the apostles. Um, and when we use the word apostle, typically it denotes sort of a mission emphasis on the person's part, um, spreading God's word in one way or another. Um, and so that the mission focus is really emphasized there. We've also used the word disciple, right? Disciples generally refers to a student, and we use that word not just in the religious sense, but also just in the regular, broader educational sense, right? If a disciple is a follower or a student, we know that also Jesus' disciples were themselves teachers after they learned from Jesus, that they used the parables to teach as well. So while all the disciples were really apostles in a way, they all had a mission, a message, and a mission to spread God's word. Not all apostles are necessarily part of the group of disciples as we know them. So that's just if that gets a little confusing. Um, so the first question here is sort of what is the purpose of this letter or epistle? And I just wanted to get into a little bit of the this question of what is an epistle and what is a letter, because we often think of them as two different things. And interestingly, um, this letter to the Romans or epistle seems to share elements of both. It's kind of a unique document in that way. So, in general, epistles are letters or messages that were sent to others in a written or verbal format. Right, that's the most general kind of definition for an epistle. Um, but letters and epistles, in the formal sense, tend to be kind of different. Usually a letter it's non-literary, right? You're not writing it for entertainment purposes. It's not typically fiction, etc. Um, and certainly the element there that it's a non-literary piece, right? It's usually personal, some kind of a personal communication from one person to another person. And there definitely is that voice in places in Paul's letter. An epistle, however, usually is viewed as a more artistic kind of literary form, using rhetoric, right? It aims to persuade, and you definitely see that element of Paul's letter to the Romans or epistle. Um, and often epistles are also intended for publicity, right? Whereas a letter is usually something that's private. So Paul's letter to the Romans or epistle seems to have both of those elements to it. Whereas that's why you'll see both it referred to as a letter to the Romans and epistle to the Romans, because it has both of those kinds of elements to it. It's also been described as having aspects of what's called a diatribe. You might be kind of aware of that word. It's usually referred to when somebody's talking about argumentation or disputation of some kind. A diatribe here basically means that um, in writing this letter, right, Paul's going to be hope some of his readers will be people um, who are not Christians, who are not familiar with God's word, and through the kind of theological lens that Paul is, right, through the um, through the Christian lens, etc. And also that he, however, wants to kind of be persuasive, and especially in among his readers who are Jews living in Rome. And when you talk about a diatribe, typically the idea is, in a piece of writing in any sense, that you are kind to try and anticipate and respond to what you think your critics might say or think. So as you're writing it and you're kind of putting yourself in the position of a reader who's skeptical and saying, okay, this person is going to ask this question or that question or have this kind of critical thought. How can I put myself in the position of that person and address that issue in this piece of writing that I'm doing? Right. So again, kind of predicting what your critic might think. Um, and that's definitely also an element of Paul's letter here, I think, because he is hoping that many of his readers will be people who, in particular, um, are Jews. Um, and this is sort of interesting, right? Because Paul himself was for years, he was born a Hellenistic Jew. Um, you could identify his family among the Pharisees in terms of their focus on Old Testament and Old Testament law, etc. And then Paul obviously had a change of spiritual awakening or um, transformation, I guess you could say. Um, and in writing this letter, he is writing as somebody who was himself not a believer. And we're thinking of, again, of New Testament Christianity here. Um, but he wants these people to know, I was just once like you. I was a skeptic and now I'm a believer. And so again, thinking about what their thoughts might be, how they might be reacting to what he's saying, so we can respond to them. Also to Gentiles as well, people who may be, not religious, one direction, one way or another. And he's also writing to the church as a whole here, right? A broader audience. So it's a complex piece of writing as far as that goes, right? Because he's got these different audiences he's writing to. These people who are far away in Rome, and we'll talk a little bit about his travels in a minute here, um, and wants to be persuasive, wants to show that he understands the people he's writing to, whose beliefs might be different, because in part, when in terms of his Jewish audience, right, that he was a Jew, etc. Um, so it definitely also makes this, I think, a very powerful, interesting piece of writing as far as that goes. Now, this was something he was writing with an eye to his many travels, right? He was somebody who, um, was again on a mission, um, and took some long journeys, certainly for the time considered long journeys, and dangerous journeys at the time. Um, and what they would often do is somebody like Paul was right ahead to a place that he hoped to travel, to prepare the people there for the fact that he would be arriving, to get there, first of all, because a lot of times they would need a place to stay, and food and other kinds of things, right? This is not somebody who's traveling with a big backpack and taking all kinds of food with them and a tent or whatever else, right? I mean, you are kind of presuming that your other believers, who are already at the place you would be traveling to, would support you, would also help to spread the word that you are arriving, and that the letter would also put you in the right mindset to know what kind of things he was going to be saying, right? To kind of pave the way for your arrival. Um, Paul was going to be traveling to Spain to preach the gospel, which is obviously an extremely long journey. It's not even on this map, right? It's well to the west of this, because he wanted to go to a place where he could sort of build his own foundation there, um, and as he put it, spiritually. Um, and he was also hoping to stop in Rome, and so this was addressed mainly to the people in Rome, telling them that he was going to be arriving at some point. Um, and you can see the different journeys that he took here. The first missionary journey, and you can see the, Antioch, Cyprus, um, into what's now Turkey, and kind of making a circular journey there. Also an offshoot. You see Troy is called Troyes here, that area. Um, Up in what we called Thessaly before, Athens, Corinth, um, and then coming back, um, was the second one of these journeys. Blue is the third journey. You can see he covered some of the same ground there, just veered off course a couple times there, some different places. Um, and It's believed that he actually wrote this, from what I've read during his third journey. Um, but I think he was kind of in the planning stages of taking this trip to Rome. The actual journey to Rome, you can see how long this journey was. Obviously, not overland the whole way. Um, Along the Aegean, we have Crete here, um, that we've talked about previously. Malta, just off the southern tip of Sicily. Syracuse, right, where the Athenians invaded during one of the last great battles of the Peloponnesian War, up through the instead of Italy here, and then all the way eventually to Rome. So for the time being, for that time, a very long journey, and you can see 59 to 62 AD, right? This is a 3-year journey we're talking about here, right? Going a very long way. And again, these were dangerous journeys. Um, um, Not just dangerous in terms of somebody attacking you, which could happen, or robbing you, but also your health could be endangered by natural disasters, or you could become ill. Um, Traveling from one place to another, where people might have different kinds of illness or disease or whatever. So these people were taking their life into their hands and trying to spread God's word, and that's I think something that really needs to kind of be appreciated here. When we think about this journey. So let me just talk about some of the themes of the message that is in this epistle or letter, because I think those are important, and he wanted his audience to be thinking about these things. One of the things that's a clear message is there was still a significant pagan population in Rome, or a population that was just starting to kind of become awakened to Christianity. And there was a time when paganism and Christianity, and even paganism and monotheism in general, kind of coexisted. But definitely there was still idol worship, right? So he warns against idol worship, and the dangers of idol worship, etc. This is not about worshiping nature. This is more about worshiping the Christian God. He also has speaks, I think, very powerfully about the fact that really only God is in a position to judge and punish other people. This was a time, in this whole era, really, where there was a lot of infighting in Rome between different religious sects. Um, um, and Depending on who had power and authority at the time, you would throw out the other groups, or you would, um, try to physically harm them, jail them, kill them, take away their rights, whatever. And obviously, Paul saw that this was very dangerous. He wanted people to see themselves as all God's people, etc. And that, again, God is only really in the position to judge and punish other people, and don't be a hypocrite, right? That message is kind of written throughout this. If you want other people to be open-minded and respectful, etc., you need to be that way yourself. And if you want to claim that you're a believer, you should act like it, right? And follow God's teachings and Christ's teachings. There's also, again, as I said, this concern about the fact that there were various groups that would make sort of exclusive claims to righteous. We are the true righteous people. These other people are heretics, etc. And again, he saw that is very dangerous, and this was also part of that mission. Again, that idea that God is really only in a position to judge and punish people. Forgiveness of sins through Christ might be the most important message here, obviously. And the fact that he's saying that this is equally true for Roman Jews and other former Jews like himself, right? That they too could be saved, and could experience the same kind of awakening and transformation that he did. And that he's not he's not writing to be judgmental of them directly himself. He's writing he's writing about and wants to preach about the opportunity they have to be forgiven for their sins, and again, to undergo the kind of awakening and transformation that he did. So that is kind of an overarching message. There's also a message that we tend to identify historically with the Catholic Church, and sometimes in distinction from Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation as it would break off. And we will talk about that in some of our future readings that we'll do. But an emphasis on the need to do good works and service, right? You still see as a very strong part of the Catholic Church today, and Catholic charities and missions, and those of you who are Catholic yourself will definitely recognize what a strong, important, central part that is of being a Catholic. Whereas historically is Protestants put faith in kind of focus on faith alone, and haven't emphasized historically the extent that the Catholic Church has good works and service. And that doesn't mean that Protestants don't believe in that or anything like that. Again, these are broad kind of theological generalizations. There's also an important issue here that also is kind of theological and philosophical, that has to do with people who haven't had God's word really introduced to them before, much less the Christian teachings, and this question of being open to God's existence in his good works and in the kind of world that he has created for human beings, and that his existence should be evident to everybody. If you just kind of look around you, the beauty of the world and of certainly the better side of humanity, as it were, and that really there it's some level kind of no excuses not to be a believer. And I think sort of what he means by that is, again, not necessarily trying to judge people who have only been surrounded by and familiar with traditional kind of pagan beliefs, but that when they are introduced to God, and in this case God through the lens of Christianity and the New Testament, etc., and Christ, that it make sense to them. They should it should be sort of one of those you're kind of recognizing that kind of awareness, that kind of realization was always kind of there for you to make, rather than being really resistant to it. That it should almost come across, if you are really somebody who's open spiritually, that you should be able to recognize seeing God in good works and the world that he has created, and etc. And that's a very powerful sort of idea. We're going to see somebody who is comes across much more critically when we read Dante's Inferno, because he kind of takes this no excuse idea to what many people would call extremes, whereby in his kind of imaginary journey through hell in Dante's Inferno, he suggests that unbaptized babies who died as babies and never were baptized, never had a chance to be awakened spiritually, etc., that they would not be welcomed into heaven. They wouldn't be in the part of hell where you're really punished, but nonetheless, they would not be able to go to heaven, and they would remain kind of on the outskirts of the Inferno, kind of as he describes it, sort of in this neutral kind of area, let's say, right? And that seems really harsh to a lot of people, and I'm sure when you read it, it might seem harsh to you too, right? Because obviously they didn't really have a chance, to be awakened spiritually, and it's not their fault that they weren't baptized if they die as babies or really young children. But so he takes a somewhat harsher, I think, sort of stance here. There are other kinds of arguments that are very interesting for belief in God and God's existence. the idea of being able to see that there's some kind of divine intelligence in the world and the kind of the order of the world, the order of the cosmos. Um, and I know we talked previously about, an idea that was very popular during Plato's time among mystics like Pythagoras, that we live in a perfectly mathematical or geometrical universe where everything makes sense, and that's why there's this really great significance given to mathematics and geometry as almost having this spiritual kind of power to it, because it could help you to understand the world that was created with a kind of mathematical or geometric perfection, and that there had to be um, a god, some larger intelligence, right? Some all-powerful creator to be able to create a universe that had these characteristics to it, and that's another kind of way of thinking about um, why somebody might believe in God and or come to believe in God is that recognition of there must be this higher intelligence that is so greater than we human beings. There are other kinds of more um, you might call them down to earth, less spiritual kinds of arguments for being a believer. Some of these, however, I'm going to talk about Pascal's wager, the mathematician Blaise Pascal, who had a kind of a logical argument for believing in God that doesn't seem very deeply spiritual. And his basic argument is that um, if you don't believe in God and there isn't a God, doesn't really make a difference. If you don't believe in God and there is a God, you're in trouble, right? At the end of your life on earth. However, if you do believe in God and there isn't one, that's not going to change your destiny. But if you do believe in God and there happens to be one, that you can be saved, right? Um, and so he says it makes sense to make this wager to say, I'm going to believe in God because in case there is one, I want to be saved, right? Um, Not a very deeply spiritual argument for having a belief in God, right? But there are a whole host of these different kinds of arguments. Rene Descartes, the philosopher, had his own kind of belief system, um, as did other philosophers, even some that were relatively agnostic that believed in the existence of a higher being of some kind, or deists, like many of the Enlightenment philosophers and people that read the Enlightenment philosophers, like James Madison and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, many of whom were deists and did believe in some kind of a higher power, but didn't necessarily subscribe to a particular religious sect or sect of Christianity, and would have their own kind of beliefs and why they believed in a higher power, et cetera. So it's kind of interesting to look at those different kinds of arguments. We'll see some other kinds of orientations to God in some of the things that we'll keep reading. Another real powerful message that I think is really woven throughout the letter is this continual or kind of repeated kind of condemnation of the body and of the dangers of the body, right? That sin and depravity are really tied to our bodily being. And again, we think about sexuality and the way we deal with and treat our sexuality as human beings. And you can even see again a little bit of some ideas similar to Plato's. I talked about in one of my Plato lectures when I talked about there's always this kind of idea in a lot of Plato's writings, especially the later writings, when Plato was writing sort of more espousing his own beliefs than Socrates' beliefs, of kind of a fantasy of wouldn't it be great if we were just pure mind and could kind of dispense with our bodies because of the fact that they cause us pain. They get old and we die and suffer. And they limit our perspective on things because they tie us to a certain time and place and perspective, right, in the world. And so there's a kind again that fantasy of being kind of a disembodied mind. And I think there's at least something somewhat parallel to that you see in Christianity, you see in Paul here, and this at least in this belief that our souls are what really make us who we are, right? Now, soul and mind are a little different here because the kind of spiritual uh, um, dimension of soul as we think of it, or might think of it from Paul's perspective, versus what Plato was thinking about mind is going to be obviously different in some sense. Um, there is, I think, that sort of parallel there. What happened, obviously, historically, as we know, when we think about things like misogyny, right, and the view of women as inferior, um, is that something that you can at least tie to this historically, especially with the emphasis on original sin, and with women being identified with their bodies. Again, Eve coming from Adam's rib, um, um, Adam being God's son, women being the daughters of of Eve, and of being seducible by the serpent as Eve was and everything, and the kind of unfortunate misogyny that kind of grew out of that, um, is that you end up seeing, certainly this is true in Western culture, Eastern culture and Eastern philosophy and Eastern theology is very different in some ways, but you certainly see it in theology and philosophy in the West, is unfortunately this identification of women more with their bodies and men with their minds. Certainly, you can see some elements of that, for example, in historically in the hierarchy in the Catholic Church, right, where men were in the position to be intermediaries between God and God's word and other human beings, whereas women aren't. We've seen that change quite a bit in my lifetime. It's actually changed, pretty radically, and I think those changes will continue, and you'll see more women church officers and priests, etc. So I think it's interesting to see how that is kind of taking place. Um, and there are certainly, and I don't want to suggest otherwise, but there are certainly places in the Bible that do emphasize more equality between men and women, right? It depends on where you're reading. It depends on the interpretive lens you're using. It depends on who the writer was. Um, and again, historically, males were in control of the church, right? And they're going to interpret things subconsciously or consciously in a way that allows them to maintain that power and authority, right? Which means putting women in a subordinate position. But all of that does become tied in with, again, women identified with their bodies, and men identified with their minds, or maybe even in a certain way here, with spirituality, and again with the church, etc. Um, there's another dimension of this that I think is really interesting as well, and that has been a point of controversy and debate that I find really fascinating. Um, and that is one you can see it in iconography of Jesus on the cross. You can see it of portrayals in film, for example, or in literature of Christ suffering on the cross, and that is the degree to which they emphasize those paintings and film, etc. Christ suffering physical pain, right? And you'll see some iconography, some paintings where he certainly looks like he's suffering, but they're not really gory portrayals, and you can really imagine that being nailed to the cross, extreme physical discomfort, right? I mean, it's beyond what we can imagine, right? Having nails put through your hands, you're left hanging by your body. I mean, it's your limbs are being pulled apart. I don't want to get too gruesome here, but all your connective tissue is being pulled apart. Just you can imagine, yeah, if we think about things in a kind of through a kind of realism, how gory and how painful and what kind of physical suffering that would mean. And so you can see iconography that really does show that, and you can see that that doesn't really show it nearly as much, right? And that's interesting, I think, right? Because and again in film and other places too, because it shows kind of a difference in the way in which there's an emphasis on, or a degree of emphasis on, the kind of humanity of Jesus, right? On that part of him that that where he wanted human beings to identify with him, to see him as like them. And I talked about that in Mark 2 as well in my lecture, in terms of this position um, of Jesus kind of being in some ways kind of in between, if you will. And again, that's a kind of a crass way of putting it, between quote unquote normal human beings and God. Um, as well. And where's the emphasis sort of put here? And that in different ways and to different degrees, Jesus would, he's portrayed in different, sometimes more in his humanity. For example, in being baptized, and his wanting to be baptized and wanting people to see that he was, his baptism. And even in some of the challenges he faced in being is somebody trying to spread God's word, but appearing just like another human being. And I talked a little bit about that in my last lecture too. And somebody who seems to be so much like you, it's hard to see them as being as different as as Jesus was. And again, the divinity aspect on the other hand. So people have different beliefs, different viewpoints, ideologies about how to portray the suffering of Jesus, and in particular because that's a central part of the iconography of the church of Jesus' life, right, of being on the cross, and whether that should really bring out the kind of the gory human aspect of that, and the fact that he is he's making a sacrifice for humankind, right, and for the sins of humankind. And other people would say that downplays the divinity, that downplays kind of the divine aspect of who Jesus was. And again, it's in a lecture like this, it's really hard to put it in a way where I can show what it would mean to be this unique kind of person that Christ was, as portrayed in the New Testament. But I think definitely it's important to kind of understand that there were one way of looking at it, again, very simplistically, is the humanity and the human element and the divine sort of element. But again, very interesting controversy, very interesting issues about how Jesus was portrayed and is portrayed in various places. So a little something to think about there. Okay, so for next time, we're moving on to Boethius' Constellation of Philosophy. You also need in the next week to read chapter 6 of Perry book, and also look at the PowerPoint for Perry chapter 6. And I know right now you're really going to be focused on your papers, and that's fine. So if you fall behind, try to make sure you get the Boethius reading done for the weekend. That is a reading that I was able to find an online version of. So the file folder in Canvas will have Boethius' Constellation of Philosophy in it. I should tell you that it alters back and forth between prose and poetry. It takes place when Boethius was thrown into prison. And in my first lecture, I'll talk a little more specifically about all of that early next week. He was somebody who became a part of the state, as it were, a part of the Roman Empire as it was really expanded, and it was starting to kind of fall apart, and there was a lot of infighting. There was an attempt to break it into 4 pieces to try and make it so you could have these four people heading up these different parts of the Roman Empire to try to hold it together because it was so huge. But then they would fight with each other over power, trying to absorb other people, including the Gauls and the Ostrogoth Empire, which I'll be talking about in the Perry book. We'll talk about. I would suggest reading at least the portion in the Perry book on Boethius and the Roman Empire before maybe reading the Boethius that I have assigned for Monday, because that you might find that helpful a little bit. But he's writing from prison, and he knows he's about to be put to death, and he's saying, he's lamenting the fact that he's being put to death and said, "I've always been a good person. Yes, I rose to a position of power, but I was not power hungry. I really wanted to serve. So why is this happening to me? And again, lamenting his situation. And Lady Philosophy, and so this is sort of philosophy appears to him in the form of this lady, this interesting feminine character that again we'll talk about. And it's sort of a dialogue that he has with her, where he's trying to understand, how did I end up where I did? I didn't do anything wrong. I tried to be a good person. Why am I having this really bad luck now? The issue of luck will come up. It's really interesting. And the idea of the Wheel of Fortune, we'll talk about that. The idea about free will. Do human beings have free will? Did Paul do something? I mean, excuse me, did Boethius do something he shouldn't do that led him to be put in prison? Why is he suffering so much? And so part of the text will be this kind of dialogue he's having with Lady Philosophy. And he put it in the form of a dialogue in part because he was very much an avid reader of Plato and Aristotle in particular. And in fact, he believed that he could unite the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. One of the few people who believe it's possible to do that. He wanted to do that as his life's work, never got it finished. But you'll see lots of pretty direct references to Plato and to the allegory of the cave and other aspects of Plato's philosophy. So look out for those in the reading. He'll talk about happiness as well in ways that are remnants of Aristotle. So you'll see both of those two things. So he does use this dialogue with Lady Philosophy, but that will alternate with sections of poetry that give, again, a more poetic take on the dialogue that comes before it. So you'll read the dialogue sections, or the more prose sections, and then the poetic sessions, and those will alternate sort of back and forth. So just so you're aware of that, and that's what we have ahead of you for that reading for Boethius. But he's very important because he translated a lot of ancient Greek philosophy into Latin. And we might not still have a lot of the great texts if it wasn't for people like Boethius. He was one of the few people during what we call the Dark Ages, as the fall of the Roman Empire is taking place here, to be so well educated and so literate, right? And you'll read about that also in Perry chapter 6. So an important person and consolation of philosophy. And it's called that because he's being consoled by philosophy in his situation. It's almost like philosophy is a kind of medicine for him. And that's kind of where the title comes from. So that's what we're doing for next week, is beginning that reading. And again, I will be doing some lectures on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. So that's what you have ahead of you. I hope you found this lecture on Paul's epistle or letter to the Romans helpful. And I'll see you again soon in my next lecture.